and welcome to this session on cities and regions. My name's Monica Baroni and I'm the CEO of the City of Sydney, and I'll be facilitating this session. Now, I'm sure like all of you, you may have noticed that these days, pretty much every second day, there's another conference about cities. Yes, you're all nodding. In fact, yesterday I was invited to another one, and it was about disruption and smart cities. However, when I looked at the actual conference, I noted that, and with all due respect to the people in this room, I noted that every single speaker was a middle-aged white man. And I said to them, you know, I don't find that particularly disruptive or particularly smart, and declined the invitation. But the question remains, why are we having so many conversations about cities? And the reason, of course, is that the world is rapidly urbanising. Already, more than 50% of the world's people live in cities or settlements, and in Australia, of course, it's way more than that. And what that does is pose challenges for the way that city leaders, city policymakers and administrators work. It means we have to find new ways of doing things, and it means we have to develop a kind of urban capacity and spatial planning capacity, which is a capacity that local government has a lot of, but other levels of government don't have quite so much of. We also have to really focus on developing that collaborative capacity. So that's why I think there are so many conversations happening about cities around the world and in this country. Today we're joined by two fabulous speakers, Peter Ho and Professor Ian Harper. Both speakers are going to speak to us for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions and conversation. We're not going to read out the biographies because you've got them in your pack. So we'll start with Mr. Peter Ho. Welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Let me see. Oh. Right. Jane Jacobs, and I think those of you who study cities would have heard of her name. She's one of these very influential people without actually a background in urban planning. But her famous book is The Life and Death of The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she wrote, city processes in real life are too complex to be routine, too particularized for application as abstractions. They are always made up of interactions among unique combinations of particulars, and there is no substitute for knowing the particulars. Now, this stands as a classic definition of the complexity that exists in cities, and indeed in all human systems. Complexity is a powerful lens that can illuminate for us the challenges and the opportunities of urban governance and what we can do in response. Now, literacy, political structures, level of industrialization, per capita income are all conventional indicators of economic health. However, economists like Hausman, Hidalgo, Luciano Petronero all suggest that an even more important predictor of growth is economic complexity, or the diversity of products that an economy possesses. Cities that are dependent on a particular kind of product or activity, for example, oil or timber, may do well when demand for these products are high, but fail in the long run because they are not diversified and cannot compete in other sectors. A case in point is Detroit, a city that built its fortunes and became highly reliant on the automotive industry. But after the Second World War, auto manufacturers began to move to suburban areas. Outside the city proper, there was also a lot of more competition. And this in turn led to residential movement to the suburbs. And from a peak of 1.85 million people in 1950, Detroit's population today is less than 700,000, a decline of more than 60%. Population flight led to loss of tax base and jobs. Detroit declared bankruptcy in 2013, and its unemployment that year was 23.1%. Now, the ability to produce, I seem to have lost something. Okay. The ability to produce unique goods and services depends on the amount of productive knowledge in an economy. And this is a kind of knowledge derived from experience and exposure to different sectors and domains of production. Invention and innovation occur when these bits of productive knowledge are connected to each other. Economic complexity facilitates these connections. The bureaucratic impulse, however, is to reduce complexity by regulation, by order, by standardization. But urban governance should not be just on reducing complexity. Far from it. Instead, in some cases, it should catalyze complexity by creating more networks to connect multiple economic domains. Now, in contrast to Detroit, Boston is a city that was shocked and surprised, but then reinvented itself at least 300 times in its 400-year history. And the Harvard economist Ed Glaeser tells of how Boston in the 17th and 18th century was a leading port in America. But by the 18th century, the mid-18th century, Boston as a port had been eclipsed, first by Philadelphia and then by New York. What saved Boston from the fate of other New England ports was a large population of Irish immigrants. And by the late 19th century, Boston had transformed itself into a center of manufacturing built on immigrant labor, and it prospered on the back of America's industrialization. But this period of heady growth was over by 1920. Population growth slowed and even began to shrink after 1950. However, Boston once again reinvented itself, this time transforming itself from an industrial city in decline into a high-tech, service-based economy. And its population grew rapidly between 1980 and 2000, reversing a quarter of a century of stagnation. And Boston today is a global center of the information economy. Its top 4 export industries are all skills-based: technology, finance, education, healthcare. Its rich, complex strengths and competencies enabled Boston to reach within itself to find new connections and value propositions. And this enabled Boston to reinvent itself time and again. When other more brittle and less economically complex cities like Detroit, heavily dependent on manufacturing, went into terminal decline. But because they are complex systems, cities also produce something called wicked problems. The political scientist Horst Rittel described wicked problems as highly complex issues, large, intractable, with no immediate or obvious solutions. And they have causes and influencing factors that are not easily determined ex ante. They hardly ever sit conveniently within the responsibility of a single agency or authority. Worse, wicked problems have many stakeholders who not only have different perspectives on the problem, but who may also not necessarily share the same goals. It is not difficult to find wicked problems in an urban setting: aging, pollution, unemployment, crime, terrorism, and so on. In other words, wicked problems cause big headaches. The German sociologist Ulrich Beck once wrote, "The world has become so complex that the idea of a power in which everything comes together and can be controlled in a centralized way is now erroneous." Indeed, no single agency is really equipped to deal with a wicked problem in its entirety. And letting departments tackle different parts of a wicked problem on their own often leads to duplication or contradictions, waste, suboptimal policies, and even to new wicked problems. So breaking down organizational silos is key to tackling the wicked problems. And they are best tackled by diverse teams drawing on different knowledge systems and experiences and sharing information drawn from large parts, if not the whole of the government system. And in Singapore, we call this the whole of government approach. The design approach that I think Dr. Nina Terry spoke about yesterday is a related concept, almost a subset of the idea of whole of government. And we adopt the whole of government approach in urban planning. While other countries have large land areas which allow new cities to develop and replace other cities that may decline in relevance and fortune, Singapore is a small island nation that does not have the luxury. Indeed, urban planning in Singapore needs to take into account the challenges of packing in housing, green space, industrial land, commercial and retail space, land for transportation needs, military training areas, all within the confines of a small island, a small city of 717 square kilometers, which is actually less than half the size of Sydney and 2/3 the size of New York. In Singapore, the entire process, from the review of our strategic concept plan to the implementation of a detailed land use master plan, involves close collaboration among economic, social, and development ministries and agencies. It also entails, importantly, consultations with various stakeholders outside government, including the private sector, as well as the general public. The whole of government approach enables all stakeholders to better understand the interdependencies and implications of land use and strategic decisions. The whole of government approach should naturally lead to a whole of society approach that aligns government, business, and community towards common goals. In Japan, in densely built-up cities like Osaka and Tokyo, there is a strong public-private partnership that builds their vast and sophisticated underground malls. Likewise, in cities like New York and Bilbao, they have Plan NYC and the Bilbao RIA 2000 respectively, which successfully serve to align the public, private, and people sectors towards common goals. It is inevitable that emerging technologies will have a disruptive impact, and this was the subject of the plenary this morning. And in recent years, a new wave of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, drones, robotics, 3D printing, big data, data analytics, cloud computing, and the Internet of Things have begun to take off. And combined with the earlier wave of infocom technologies, they promise to be game changers, giving individuals capabilities and powers that were previously the province only of governments and large organizations. Cities, societies, and economies are actually becoming more and more disintermediated. For example, Uber and Airbnb are already challenging the status quo. A whole new type of economy, the sharing economy, is emerging on the back of such disruptors. But the sharing economy, which is predicted by PwC to be worth $335 billion by 2025 globally, has seen cities around the world clamping down on platforms such as Uber and Airbnb. And these are often reactions to local protests and concerns over the risks that such innovations pose. Now, governments can play it safe and watch from the sidelines, or they can get some skin in the game now through research, test bedding, and pilots, so that they learn the limitations and potential of such technologies in order to be ready when these technologies really take off. There are cities such as Seoul, Amsterdam, that already embrace the sharing economy. They encourage initiatives to grow the sharing economy through innovation and in tandem to implement light touch policies to manage the risks. In this regard, cities that have ambitions to succeed in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, or VUCA world should be willing to put aside tried and tested perspectives and instead to experiment with new innovations offered by emerging technologies, such as those found in the sharing economy. And for such cities, pilot programs, prototypes, beta versions should be the norm, even if they cannot be entirely certain of the outcome. If such experiments succeed, then they can be expanded. If they fail well, it's a lesson to be learned. Given the scale of urban settings, governments are often in a much better position than individuals or organizations to introduce mitigating measures so that there's protection against failure. In Singapore, we have taken this approach in addressing the problem of congestion in public transport systems. A precinct in Singapore will be the site of a major pilot for the use of autonomous vehicles or driverless cars, testing not just the technologies for the cars, but also for the road furniture. Singapore is also going to experiment with autonomous vehicles that can transport people and goods in the future for intertown first and last mile travel. We are also going to experiment with truck platooning with autonomous driving technologies for logistics and freight transportation. New regulations on traffic management, insurance, and so on will also be developed in tandem with the operational experience gained from such pilots, experiments, and trials. Now, the complexity of the operating environment of cities creates a lot of uncertainty. As a result, governments are often called on to make big decisions and develop plans and policies under conditions of incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. And of course, prediction is not possible. Instead, the approach should be to reduce uncertainty wherever possible. And an orientation towards thinking about the future in a systematic way is the right approach. Some of us call this process foresight or futures thinking. And the practice of foresight is really about identifying the factors that will shape the future. This is so that policymakers can devise strategies and formulate policies to maintain positive trajectories and shift negative ones in a more positive direction. The goal is to make better decisions today and shape the future, not to predict what it will be. Now, scenario planning is one way to do this, in the sense that it projects different possible futures based on our understanding of the operating environment today. And used intelligently, it can be a very important tool for planning and can help overcome cognitive biases by challenging our mental models. Scenarios make people aware of problems, uncertainties, challenges, and opportunities that such a complex environment would present, and open up their imagination and initiate learning processes. For the past 2 decades, the Singapore government has been using scenario planning. National scenarios are developed at a whole of government level every few years, and these then help the ministries and agencies in anticipating in their policies and plans, even budgets, of the challenges and opportunities that could arise in the future. Our urban concept plan and master plan are all based on scenarios developed for Singapore many years into the future. Scenarios have therefore been very useful in helping our city-state to navigate complexity across time. The complexity of cities needs to be managed. Too little complexity leads to brittleness. The right level of economic and social complexity that gives a city the resilience of, say, Boston, is partly due to good luck, but also due to good governance. And the most adaptable and flexible cities are the ones that will survive and succeed over the long term. The rise of complexity in the world today throws up enormous challenges for urban governance. Foresight will help governments to better deal with complexity and its challenges. But the fundamental changes are also needed to the organization of government. Whole of government approach should be nurtured and extended where possible to include business, civil society, and other actors. Collectively, they contribute to the broad concept of governance, even if they are not part of government traditionally defined. The future of urban governance lies in such systems-level coordination to facilitate better forward planning, foresight, and futures thinking. Thank you.